Hello, and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout free. The one that you had Justin, Lena, and Todd still participating. So I wanted to thank you for your collaboration on that. And even though Todd is no longer with our group, I'm just going to make a comment for your group as you discussed those issues. So the things that we discussed in Google Hangout free related to public apathy, community preparedness, community resilience, and those topics related to the levels of heeding of risk and preparing for and mitigating against hazards. And so Lena kicked off a discussion on the sources of apathy in preparedness, and linked back to Ruben in our readings for this semester about complacency, denial, and hubris. If you remember, three enemies of emergency management, and certainly as far as preparedness, complacency and being afraid of change. I think that the thing about change is a really good way to look at as we organizations and communities like the status quo, and they feel very well in a comfort zone, and specifically as they are engaged in day-to-day operations, it's very hard to think strategically about something of maybe lower occurrence or lower likelihood, even though the consequence might be higher. So we sort of get lulled by the everyday routine, and it is harder to get mobilized to think about critical events, particularly as the time passes and more time elapses from the latest one, right? Because you talked about familiarity and proximity to that last event that will affect the level of preparedness. And the research definitely documents that people that had recent experiences tend to prepare more than people that had experiences in the past, but more far removed. So certainly you talked about denial, and with that Lena discussed the education and awareness and public awareness. And I think it's really important to, a lot of times we put the burden of preparedness on citizens and communities, and yet our educational programs are not very targeted. And it's we can have those notification systems and warning systems that we're going to have 60 inches of rain, and for a general citizen that has never experienced that, 60 inches of rain, it's not a very actionable warning. It's very hard to relate to that for somebody that's never had 60 inches of water in their home. They don't understand what it does to a person on the street, what it does to a car, what it does to a home. So just those communications or warnings are perhaps not very actionable for people to heed, for we discussed the topic of evacuations and so on and so forth. A really, really big part of it is opposing interest groups, as Lena indicated. Certainly when you have big developers and private industries, specifically in the United States, you have critical infrastructure that's privately owned, for most part, 90% of it. And so with that comes the the business model, economic concerns, the profitability, and developers are going to develop as far as the legislation will let them, and as far as regulations will not stop them. So developing areas that are low-lying areas, developing areas that are earthquake-prone, developing areas or not having proper codes for earthquakes. You mentioned all those factors in your discussion. Proper regulation, proper land use, proper codes, proper systems, certainly if they're not in place, it's harder for people to prepare, because, how do you prepare if you are already in that low-lying area? It's just the problem lays a little bit more in a scope of mitigation, happens much earlier. it's preventing people moving into those areas in the first place, or giving them safeguards, how to raise their homes or whatever they might do as far as mitigation strategies. So you mentioned that lack of public awareness. People a lot of times are not educated about, floodplains or flood zones. When I first moved to Texas, I had never experienced a flood until I moved to Texas, because I lived in California. And there was earthquakes pretty much. So, when I was looking for a house, if I wasn't told by somebody about, making sure that I looked at the land use as far as, the floodplains in my area, I might have not necessarily have known that. And if you take people that are new to the area, or less educated, or don't have as many resources and have to buy in the area that maybe is more vulnerable, then certainly that affects their levels of being prepared. Public apathy, again, and I think Justin reiterated that, is public apathy and maladaptation, what I call maladaptation. So people that go through those events eventually develop mechanisms that are coping mechanisms, not necessarily good ones. You get through it once, you get through it again, you get through it again, and you just get through it. So preparedness is not really huge concern, because the history or experience has taught people that they can sort of navigate through the event. And unfortunately, you navigate through 4, 5, 6 small hurricanes, and then you have this Harvey, right, which is really more of a rain event. And so it's a totally new set of circumstances. And this is, people get into the apathy, where their adaptations are just, adaptations to really bad conditions without proper awareness. Some other issues that you mentioned, I think, Justin, you talk about the defeatism. So, why should I prepare if, it does not really do much anyway? Disasters are so unique that no matter how you plan, the next one is never going to be like the last one. So that's definitely a factor. That lack of replicability of a same disaster over time cannot give you exactly a checklist, what's going to work and what's not going to work. And that, throws a lot of people off. If they're not given, most of the people, and that's what research says, if you tell them exactly what adjustments they need to make, they'll make them, if they're within the scope of their resources and their capability to do it. So if you tell people to put wooden boards in their windows, and you tell them where to buy cheap boards and nails, they will do so. If you tell them to buy generators, less so, because this is a very, very expensive piece of equipment for most people that do not have more than $500 savings in their account from month to month. Buying a generator is a huge expenditure. So again, people will adjust and take protective actions, or plan or prepare, if it's very actionable and if it's within the scope of their means. But because those disasters are different, collecting water for one event might be totally, bottled water, totally useless in Harvey. It's floating around the house and you have to throw it away because it was contaminated. So I think Todd sort of joined you on that discussion of events. Still, a lot of people look at those events as the acts of God, so that they are not avoidable, that they're going to happen, and they're going to happen with a certain cycle. And so, planning is futile. And again, this is that lack of awareness of going back to mitigation, because, I think that mitigation is the most forgotten part of emergency management cycle. And this is where everything starts. If we don't mitigate through regulation and through right urban design and through proper coastline building or whatever it might be, then we're really putting a burden on people where they're already, at a disadvantage. And so this is where, again, you have defeatism, because people don't believe that, whatever they do, it's just going to not be enough in a disaster anyway. So it's better not to do much and sort of coast through it and hope for the best. And if you take into account that it is the act of God, then of course you feel like you're less in control as well. So there is not that internal feeling that people can control their environment. And that goes usually with higher education. The higher sense of advocacy is linked to higher level of awareness and understanding of risk. And I think Justin had a really good discussion on that understanding the levels of what's involved and what things can do to us. A lot of times what we hear or warnings that we hear don't really truly represent or show what the potential risk might be. And again, there is a delicate balance, because the research shows that if you scare people, if you tell people that the risk is really, really high and you overblow the risk, then they're defeated. But if you don't tell people, clearly that there is a risk and what actions to take, then they might downplay it. So finding a balance in risk communications is very important, because people that are overscared will not prepare, and people that are underscared will not prepare. Is that the right level of assessment of risk? And I really like that you raised it in a conversation and in your discussion. This is what fosters better approach to planning and preparedness in the communities and families. Lena mentioned, Lena had this presentation on Halabja massacre and chemical weapons, and I think you brought it out that, there are some hazards that very few people have awareness of what they can do, and that's certainly the truth with chemical weapons. So it's hard to have a perception of risk for general population if they've never ever had a knowledge or understanding of what those things can do to them. And particularly with chemical weapons, if we're on it, when you talk about that balance about risk, it's very easy to scare people. And so they're going to be overwhelmed. Or you can also say that they're so infrequent, those events, that the risk of terrorism with a chemical weapon is so low that might not want to make people invest in training, or particular agencies, emergency response agencies, to invest in things like CAMPAC or things that are going to mitigate or that are part of a preparedness. So looking at a perception of risk, again, you brought out Dravik in your discussion, which I thought was very good, and you looked at how public perceives the risks. This is how they're gonna eventually adjust to their levels of preparedness. Justin mentioned that the preparedness is enhanced in recent times by much better technologies, and that's certainly a mitigating factor for people preparedness. The ubiquity of information, the ability of accessing that information, the all kinds of different methods that you can disseminate information, more so than during the times of pigeons in 1906 San Francisco earthquake. That's the only thing that really worked. We have a lot more access to technologies, and we can, radar things. We can sensing technologies for earthquakes, the forecasting, the modeling of weather patterns. Those are certainly huge assets if they are leveraged in preparedness, because there's one thing that the technologies are there, and there's the other thing whether the agents are actually integrating them and using them. And sometimes, agencies will invest a ton of money in very, very expensive technology that they don't know how to leverage, they don't know how to use, and they don't train on it. And I have seen it time and time again. Sometimes the simplest solutions, are are working, but people invest in very sophisticated solutions and they have this feeling of invulnerability, and then those systems go down, or people are not versed in how to use them to what they're supposed to do. So technology is a friend and technology is a foe in disaster, if you want to look at it this way. But certainly our planning, if we're thinking about complacency or denial, yes, those are social dimensions, and there are, psychological dimensions. If we're thinking about the availability of tools, we certainly have progressed, and those we have a lot more things at our disposal. Now, later in the discussion, you also talked about how those technologies are not accessible to all, and certainly. If you have elderly that don't have smartphones or are not on Twitter and they're not on, all those social networks for dissemination of information, there's going to be some marginalization with the use of technologies as well. So it's a friend and it's a foe. Todd, you mentioned that training has improved as well in emergency management organizations and response organizations. Certainly, we are all measuring things in response times nowadays. And, active shooter, we look at, how fast those contact teams can form, where before, you had to wait for a long time before you had a group or, a SWAT team enter, a particular site. Now with those active shooter events, those response times are quicker and quicker. And of course, again, better training standards, better dissemination of training, more professionalization as well. We are seeing it, a lot of leadership development in emergency management, law enforcement organizations, that, things that used to be trades or crafts have entered a sphere of profession. And so they are being professionalized. With that comes more training and more required training. And of course, Lena talked about the history teaching us very valuable lessons, lessons from Katrina, things that we learned because of those focusing events. And certainly the entire semester, we are discussing focusing events, from the Jonesboro floods to Mississippi floods, the Dust Bowls, the earthquakes, the Texas City chemical explosion, all those events that triggered some type of legislation or some type of codes or some type of public awareness for the next time, for the next event. So certainly you mentioned that those are part of a history and we learn from them. I think you discussed the Flint and the water issue and contamination, and that those jurisdictions that do experience those events on a large scale with a large impact tend to pay attention to those issues, tend to prepare for it. So, maybe the issue in Flint was localized and, it's relevant to that area. Maybe somebody in Texas that hasn't been affected by that type of event will have less awareness of it. So you talked about state-to-state differences or regional differences in preparedness based on your vulnerability. I think that's the word I was looking for. Every jurisdiction or every geographical area will have certain vulnerability. Some risks are more prevalent than others, and it's just where you live, right? I told you I didn't know anything about floodplains before I came to Texas because, I was mainly preoccupied with earthquakes and fires, and protective actions for those or planning or mitigating against those. So then you move to a different area and the vulnerabilities are different. And so you advocate for those that are familiar to you. And that goes back to, looking at those factors that affect preparedness. Justin listed them all as they were in your reading. So experience, familiarity, and distribution of risk. Certainly we all agree again that somebody that has witnessed something firsthand and had to cope through it is going to prepare more, especially if it's within a certain time frame. So your experience with a particular hazard, a particular threat, makes you more educated about it. So ultimately, if you're more educated or aware, you will tend to plan more or think about a lot more things related to that hazard. Familiarity is linked, as you said in your discussion, to experience. The two go together. And then the distribution of risk. Again, the distribution of risk being in what areas, what particular jurisdictions are more vulnerable to what. What are we are going to prepare. It's human nature. We will take the highest risk and we'll attend to it first before we go to the lower level risk, even if it's a higher consequence of it, because it's something that we can put our arms around. Most people get very scared in the United States about terrorism, but certainly they do not prepare for it on any given day because the likelihood of coming across a terrorist event is so low, and if it's never happened to them as well. Whereas the natural hazards are prevalent, more debilitating to larger groups of people with a much longer impact. You've got a terrorist event, the loss of life is pretty much, the biggest concern. When you have hurricanes and floods and those type of events, then it's economical impact. It's, you're losing home, you can lose family members as well, and pets, and, and so on and so forth. So we look at this highest likelihood of something happening and we'll do some adjustments for that. And then all the other things that are not distributed the same way in our area, we tend to ignore. Todd, again, talking about the focusing event, he mentioned the Katrina and 9/11 being the watershed moments, focusing events, and that, our understanding and awareness of certain types, related to denial and complacency maybe got changed. There's a certain paradigm shift about our denial of certain threats, specifically with 9/11 and certain large-scale social implications of disaster that came out of Katrina. And then, certainly some comments on a Hurricane Pam. Hurricane Pam exercises and risk assessments for Katrina predicted the levees breaking, and discussed that eventuality, but that type of education wasn't well integrated, or because it hasn't happened before, so there was no experience with it, and there was no familiarity with it, even though some simulated scenarios, were suggesting that this was going to happen. People were not preparing because they didn't have a direct experience with it. So to a certain point, training and education is really critical, but experience comes to really augment that need or sense of urgency for preparedness. Certainly, you mentioned DRABEC again in your discussion on that, on mobilizing the levels of consensus about risk. What strategies can emergency managers use to increase the preparedness, and certainly creating a shared understanding of risk is really in how to mitigate it. So how to take away the high levels of vulnerability. And experience is critical. Lena mentioned in relationship to experiences that people that have experienced flooding or hurricanes, know the steps. It's sort of like a muscle memory. You have gone through those things before. So every next one gives you a little bit more and more of a ability to plan or prepare, because it becomes a part of repertoire of what you do seasonally, let's say, between May and September in Texas when we enter a hurricane season. So people will be more likely to think about their supplies or communication plans, or making sure that maybe their vehicles are operational, and so on and so forth. But Justin also talked about the double-edged sword on familiarity, and I like that example. I think I saw it in your PIO report on Venice. So familiarity breeds contempt and complacency as well. So when you are too familiar with a certain hazard, then you tend maybe to overestimate or underestimate the the risk that's related to it. And you mentioned Venice and people walking and waiting in the streets and swimming in a community that's flooded. It potentially, we know what kind of toxic waters those can be coming from the floods. And again, the experience and familiarity can enhance preparedness, can make people more complacent, it can also lack of familiarity or lack of experience sometimes can sparkle innovation as well. So if we go through the same motions over and over again, maybe we don't think out of the box, so to speak. And I think that's the point that you were trying to make. Okay, the next question that you discussed was the one on focus in emergency management being on infrastructure versus on communities and a social fabric. So on those soft elements of community versus critical infrastructure. And I think that you agreed that we tend to focus more on physical structures, on critical infrastructure, specifically those lifelines, and less so on communities. And the examples that you were giving was the dumping of the reservoir waters to prevent the catastrophic failure of the Barker and Attic reservoirs during Harvey. And you mentioned also the flooding in Central Texas, and how it was the concern about the engineering cost and supporting the engineering infrastructure elements at the expense of communities that drove decisions in Hurricane Harvey, and I certainly agree with that. So the sense being, we deal with the communities later. We just now have to prevent the catastrophic failure of those infrastructures, because certainly there's some logic to it, because those infrastructures are also connected. So one failure can lead to another failure. And it's, as you mentioned, it's a social problem that, we less concerned about communities, because communities are not measured in dollars. The losses are not measured in dollars. Although you can put a value of $1 for insurance purposes on somebody's life or loss of limb or so on and so forth. But generally, that's a little bit the different calculation of risk. And so we tend to calculate risk on an economic basis. And because we have historically calculated risk on an economic basis, we now, in our approach to emergency management, have hard time getting the concept of community brought in before we get a concept of a building. Justin talks about fact of with infrastructures, it's much easier to show that you have rebuilt something like a structure. So if you rebuild a home, if you rebuild a bridge, this is a quick return of a community to normal. You can reinstate business and stuff like that. Reinstating people to their well-being of a recovery It's very, very hard to measure. It's very hard to tell what the beginning and the end is. The human recovery takes time. Assessing the community, whether it's recovered, is more difficult. But when we can build something and show for it as well, so in the recovery, we tend to do that more or focus on that more because it's, how would you say it? You can assess it, you can measure it more. And so I thought there was a ugly truth about dollars. I think that was Justin's statement. Todd was mentioning something without calling it that, but Todd was talking about how you take those communities that suffer from disasters and now you are revitalizing them and rebuilding them, and you can show that they're now thriving communities. That's why we focus on infrastructure, because we can show that we've rebuilt. But then certain social issues and people and poverty and vulnerabilities are sort of moved out of that area that we've rebuilt and moved somewhere else. It doesn't mean that we've resolved it. So at the social, in a way, social recovery, or looking at preparedness of communities, it's more insidious because you don't see the results as much. And the process that Todd was describing that is known in emergency management literature is the process of gentrification. If you've ever heard about gentrification, what gentrification is when you take the area that was socially vulnerable to a disaster, let's say, and it suffered greatly. And everything fell apart. The social ties, the infrastructure, the capital, social capital, the economy, the institutions, the response organizations. And it was a tremendous fallout for lack of preparedness. And then there's a rebuilding process, and a lot of funding is dedicated to remedy that community. But if it starts with buildings and roads and stores and stuff like that, that's what you rebuild. But you're not curing the actual issues, social issues that exist in the community. And now you are having a real nice storefront with a real nice restaurant that serves $100 dinner, which those people cannot afford. So they are moving somewhere else, and they are taking those social problems to a different community where they are becoming an issue. That's the process of gentrification, pretty much. And it happens. It happened in New Orleans. Certain areas that have gotten rebuilt are cost prohibitive for certain people, indigenous populations that lived there before, and they had to leave and evacuate. And when they came back, they couldn't live in those areas because they were too expensive for them. So that gentrification process is a really huge social equality and social justice issue in emergency management and disaster management. Why is community disaster resilience difficult to achieve? Based on the movie from Australia, you had a really good discussion on that, on knowing the demographics, assessing the demographics of the area, reaching people, being able to, to have a certain way of accessing people in certain areas. Specifically in Australia, the demographics are important. We know that, vulnerabilities have zip codes. And a lot of times those vulnerabilities are one on top of another. So if you take a certain zip code in Houston, you're going to know that in a certain zip code, the vulnerability of going to a violent school overlaps with vulnerability of getting flooded, overlaps with vulnerability of getting shot, overlaps with the vulnerability of being subjected perhaps to lack of ability to evacuate during a sudden onset of a disaster. So those are compounded social vulnerabilities in certain areas. Climate change, you talked about climate change as far as Australia, understanding that the way we are interacting with the environment changes the environment in a way that we're going to have to learn how to live with consequences of this. And we're still, I think, in denial about the anthropomorphic changes on the environment that we as humans are placing, and we are causing those, a lot of those, what we call acts of God or natural phenomena by our exploitation, deforestation, globalization, moving different species across the globe, and exposing different hybrids of plants, and and things like that. So our human activity has impacted the environment, and that's what they call anthropomorphic changes upon the environment. So in a lot of ways, they're not acts of God's, they're our own activity impacts the environment. And certainly climate change is an understanding what it means. Again, we talked about the risk and the 60 inches of water, but I like to use after Harvey. What is 60 inches of water? For most people, it's, well, I don't know, 60 inches of water. It's less than, that I am tall. I can probably deal with it. But it's not just 60 inches of water. It's moving water. It's debris. It's toxicity. It's speed. It's bringing everything else with it. Now, when you're talking about 4 degrees climate change, for most people, it's like, well, it's 4 degrees. On a good day, 72 degrees or 76 degree day is still a nice spring day. But 4 degrees looked at from scientific perspective of permafrost melting in areas that trap gases, so they don't get released into the atmosphere. And when this permafrost somewhere, in Alaska disappears, those gases will be released, and we will be dealing with totally different air quality and so on and so forth. Now, that conversation becomes different than 4 degrees, right? The entire species of animals becoming unavailable, which will cause other animals to thrive and maybe overpopulate and affect the environment in a different way. So again, we have a tendency of very, very short, myopic look at what those things mean, and that affects our ability to be disaster resilience, a community disaster resilience. Something about global warming or climate change for that matter, and not to be too controversial, but changes in climate patterns are such a remote thing for most people to think about. So again, they are looking at that most common denominator of what they understand, and 4 degrees, again, it's like 60 inches of water. Justin, I think, talked about the climate change being a universal challenge, not just in Australia, but certainly we have those phenomena, weather phenomena, that are becoming larger and larger. And most people are not concerned. Of course, the leadership has a big part in how people view those kind of hazards or threats. And if the leadership is, the leadership of the country or policymakers do not support those research findings, then certainly the public is not going to be alarmed to do anything about it, because they trust that the policymakers are making the right decisions for them. So I really liked your conversation on a shared challenge with respect to, again, differences in demographics, distribution of wealth, certainly, distribution of risk. Some areas of the world, we see it now, distribution of risk is huge in preparedness. Sorry, let that play out. Actually, it might be 5 rings because it's 5 o'clock. My apologies. So the distribution of risk, somebody running away from the Golden Triangle from Central America, or areas like Honduras or Salvador that are experiencing increased levels of violence that affects the population displacement movement, and certainly I think those phenomena are only are going to become more and more accentuated in the future. Again, distribution of resources with distribution of risk. You talked about demographics and resources. This is where you had the conversation, Todd and Lena. I think you were bouncing back and forth on that, about access and about the elderly, about marginalized populations. That emergency management strategies tend to be devised for a average Joe, but we're not looking at those people at the margins or at the boundaries, with lower SES or different health capabilities, or different social status, or different age category, and certainly that makes it very difficult for MEGA to create this community community resilience, community disaster resilience in a community, because you have to account for all those different groups of people, and you have to know what your demographics are. Certain demographics may not be well informed linguistically because they don't speak the language. And we just had a discussion with my group on in the intelligence class, and I mentioned that the Vietnamese and Deepwater Horizon, the boat operators, they had no idea what they were getting into when they volunteered to help BP with the oil spill response, because most of the hazard information that they received, they didn't even understand. They were, sort of co-opted to help, but they were not properly educated. And again, money was important. Then you also mention some other cultural differences. It's enough to say, there are different beliefs and different values, and some people won't vaccinate because of a religious belief. Some people don't even take medical care or don't believe in in science on that. And so how do you deal with those groups to be resilient to certain types of risks that might be present in their communities? If you have entire sectors of a society in a particular community that believe in certain rituals that might be unhealthy, that might spread the risk of a disease, for example. We all know that the spread of Ebola in Africa had to do with their funeral rites and and how you say goodbye to your loved ones when they die and all that, and that causes the transmission of a disease. So all those, for emergency management to sort of look at a community to create that disaster resilience, there's just all those different aspects that have to be taken into account. And again, when everything else fails to account why people don't prepare, we often say, yeah, God will provide. A lot of people have that attitude of, sort of laissez-faire. It's called laissez-faire. Whatever is going to be, and those are the acts of God, and this is how it's supposed to evolve. And if I'm supposed to live, I'll live. If I'm supposed to be saved, I'll be saved. And if not, that's God's will. So that complacency may be having roots in some religious beliefs as well. Then you moved into, so really good discussion. I'm trying to not to be too wordy on looking at what you talk about, but you had a really extensive discussion on that. Strategies for to consider in emergency management to enhance the desire to prepare and to be disaster resilient. Certainly, heeding the warnings. The Todd mentioned that disasters are consequences of human decisions. So looking at things differently, making different decisions based on lessons learned. Communications, proper communications, professional communications. Justin really focused on the fact that on that messaging, tell people exactly specifically what they're expecting to do. I mentioned those adjustments that are very, very specific, and then they can do, that they have resources to do, that they are not overwhelming to people. Training and preparing, mitigation, and I think Lena talked about, we spend a lot of money on tourism, but, attending to risks that are more common or to which certain communities might be vulnerable is really important to have that in front of us and focus the design strategy. So the emergency management in different jurisdictions are going to have different priorities. And again, having more of a futuristic approach or more of an imagination-based approach for the agents of change in emergency management, to where we don't prepare for the last disaster always. So, thinking strategically about, if we had a 10 feet of water last time on the last flood, we do not build a 10 feet barrier, because this is a very reactive way of looking at things. Maybe do a better research, maybe do a better simulation, maybe do a better leveraging of technologies to project more in a futuristic way of anticipating the consequences and building or mitigating in a way that it's not just based on the last year's scenario. And again, the ongoing maintenance. I think Lena mentioned that, there's a lot of technology we invest in, but then it's not used and it's not being maintained. So the frequency of certain events might make certain preparedness actions not very usable. And then eventually we fall into the complacency again. Skills and competencies of emergency managers. I think you discussed collaboration, organization, being able to reach across, as you look, and Todd had a good discussion on that, as you look at all those different requirements for community disaster and resilience, knowing the demographics, knowing the culture, knowing religions, knowing different linguistic groups, different age groups, different parties involved, creating a shared sort of concept for that particular community, then who is able to do that? Those are going to be the people that are extremely good and flexible and recognizing that there is more than one stakeholder, building partnerships, being connected, ambassadors and linking pins. Diverse backgrounds, people that know cultural differences, that are not necessarily, that are understanding the communities beyond them or beyond their particular background and cultural heritage. Decision makers have to be facilitative, delegating, decisive, certainly. Knowing how to use people is a huge asset in leadership. If you can identify talent with those skills, emergency manager, one person cannot know all those things. One person cannot speak all those different languages, know all those cultural backgrounds. So surrounding yourself with a group of people that have talents in those areas is really critical. And those are change agents of the future, is the people that can sort of identify talent and know what talent would fit what need by the, for that particular community disaster resilience building. Open mindset, certainly. Guts, and humanity and equality and being inclusive. So you nailed on some really, really important things that are related to emotional intelligence, the ability to work across all those different obstacles, really, the ability to change different age groups, different various backgrounds, and certainly people that are lifelong learners that want to learn new things, they want to get certifications. As a field of emergency management expands, and you mentioned technologies and radars and detection systems, and it's becoming more and more complex, the professionals cannot be people that do not do ongoing maintenance in their level of understanding, level of learning, and professional development. So with that, you are here because you are professionals who want to expand their portfolio, and your background and experience. And, if you consider emergency management, I think that emergency management will continue to develop and professionalize. And it is, I don't think that's the area that goes anywhere anytime soon. And it permeates, most of the, most of our routines. And so I hope that you have come up with some good strategies or some good observations on planning and building resilient communities in the future. And I thank you for your discussion. I'm looking forward to your Google Hangout 4, which I received, and I'm going to watch either today or tomorrow. So sorry for the interruptions as well, as far as the clocks and the devices. And I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.